Hey there, it's Jon Fleischman with SoDoesItMatter.com, where we seek to look at what's going on in California politics and policy. Sometimes I like to say that our actual motto is chronicling the burning of Rome, because sometimes in California, you just look at the policies and what's going on, and you just compare the largesse of Sacramento to what actually ended the Roman Empire, which was not defeated by a foreign enemy. The Roman Empire was defeated by the greed of its own citizens and its own people, and eventually they grew government to the size of collapse. So hopefully that won't be what happens here. I am very excited about our guest that we have today, and I'm going to introduce him in just a moment. But before I do that, actually, I could tell you who it's going to be because you already know, because it's right next to the podcast. It's Rick Travis, who is the legislative director for the California Rifle and Pistol Association, of which I am a proud member for several years now. But before I introduce, first of all, hi, Rick.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Rick, we have a tradition here on this podcast, which it might be kind of zany, but it is what it is. Before you logged in, I went on to ChatGPT and I simply said, I am going to be introducing Rick Travis of the California Rifle and Pistol Association as a guest on my podcast. Give me an introduction. And as my guests know, ChatGPT by now has figured out I'm a conservative, so they're pretty good. But I have not read this. But I'm gonna put on my glasses because I'm getting older, and I'm going to read it now. And this is how they say I'm supposed to do it. I'll put on my radio voice. Hi, this is Jon Fleischman with So Does It Matter? And today we're diving into one of the most aggressive and fast-moving policy areas in California, gun control legislation coming out of Sacramento. If you want to understand how these laws actually get written, negotiated, amended, and pushed through the system, you need someone who lives inside that process every single day. Rick Travis is the legislative director for the California Rifle and Pistol Association, and he's not just watching these bills, he's working them. He understands the mechanics, how proposals evolve behind closed doors, how votes are lined up, where pressure is applied, and how policy language turns into real-world consequences for millions of Californians. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain. What's really happening in the Capitol right now, which bills actually matter, and where it's all headed next. Rick, welcome to the podcast.
Wow, that was pretty nice.
Well, all I know is they've set a real high expectation for you. So if you don't know exactly how the votes are lined up and where the pressure is applied, my readers are or watchers, we're going to be very disappointed. Rick, I guess the first thing I would say is maybe you could tell us a little bit more that the ChatGPT won't tell. So how long have you been with CRPA, and how did you get involved with the Second Amendment issue in the first place?
I've been in CRPA for 15 years now on staff. I was with them for about 4 years on the board. Never intended to be on staff. I came on working with youth shooting sports, largely with Boy Scouts, 4-H and Future Farmers of America programs, and got talked into helping out in some of the field work, and then got involved with some of the hunting policy and conservational policy, which led me eventually to the position I'm in as the legislative director for all legislative policy.
Great. And how did you get involved in Second Amendment issues or gun rights? Did you have that BB gun when you were a kid and it went from there?
Yeah, I grew up, I lived in the South Bay growing up, involved with dog kennels and raising dogs. And back when I was a kid, the South Bay wasn't all concrete. Gardena, where I grew up, had a lot of dairy farms and stuff. So I grew up around that, learning to shoot in Cub Scouts and later on Boy Scouts. And my grandparents also had part ownership in a sheep ranch up in Sonoma before it became the wine capital of the state. And so spent summers up there helping to protect the sheep and learning some of that things. I didn't think of it as a Second Amendment issue. I just thought of it as hey, this is shooting and go out with grandpa and once in a while dad, but more my grandfather and learning how to do things. Yeah.
Then one day the government came along and decided they wanted to start inhibiting your ability to protect the sheep.
Yeah.
So, all right. So before I jump into a few questions, I wanted to encourage people that are watching, as you're watching this and you're enjoying it, I don't know where you're watching it. If you're watching it on Substack, I'd encourage you to hit the little heart button or the restack button. If you're watching it on YouTube, like it, subscribe to it, which helps our algorithm to spread the news. And then Chuck Michelle, who is the volunteer president and general counsel of CRPA, who was a guest of ours on a previous podcast, which I'll link down below. It was quick to lead out with how people can get a hold of CRPA. Why don't you
Yeah,
really
sure.
quickly kind of lay that out.
Yeah, you can go to our website, crpa.org, and you can join. You can get involved with any number of programs we have throughout the state of California. It's not just about litigation or legislation we're going to talk about today. It's about programs for women, programs for youth. There's scholarships for kids wanting to go to college. There's multiple shooting programs, multiple things to help you if you have a firearms business or you work or run a range. There's always something new developing. And if you need to even get a hold of me or Chuck or anybody else on staff, you can always reach out at contact@crpa.org. And then just inside the messaging area, put this is for, and then insert that staffer's name, and it will go directly to us.
Great. And I'm going to add as a member, I'm going to add that, and I'll have the link for the website below, but also you want to get over to YouTube. They run an operation that is just called CRPA TV, and it's fantastic. They put out a lot of great updates. Rick is frequently the guest on that program, as is Chuck and others, talking about what's going on. CRPA does a lot in the legal space, fighting litigation wise, but that's not what we're going to talk about today because we don't have the lawyer with us today.
Nope, the lawyer.
Today we have the I'll call him the in-house lobbyist with us today, the
Right.
legislative director. And so I guess maybe we should start with a brief history of gun control in California, because my sense is that for a lot of California's history, we were not really known as the gun control capital of America. I feel like that's a relatively recent thing. When I say relatively, in the last few decades rather than the last few centuries. But maybe you can tell me.
Yeah. So I think that's a lot of people's reaction is this has been more recent, say like in the last 20 years. Actually, since the
Mm.
state became a state, when California first
Oh
became a state,
boy.
it was democratically controlled, Democratic governor. And people weren't even allowed to put food on their table. They weren't allowed to hunt for themselves. You had to go through a licensed market hunter to bring your meat. The vast majority of people did not have firearms in California. It was looked very, very down on. You couldn't have a hunting license in California. So there were a lot of restrictions on what we would call Second Amendment rights. And then what happened was right after the end of the Civil War, about 10 years later in 1875, it shows you how things have changed. The mayor of San Francisco, the mayor of Oakland, and the head of the state National Guard came together and said, Californians, because they didn't have access to guns, didn't do too well in the Civil War. They weren't really good marks people. So
Oh,
let's form an
interesting.
organization, which was known as the California Rifle Association, and said, let's form that and start pushing back and training people how to be safe with firearms, do it. Ironically, within a year, we went out to go against the New York association, which later on would become the NRA. We beat them our first year. I always like to point that out, that California won the first time out. And then what happened from there was over the next few decades, they worked with Fish and Game to open up hunting throughout California where people could put food on the table. They had a couple of different events. They had 5,000 people show up to a shooting event before the turn of the last century, which is a huge number, John. And it was also a huge number that it was people of all backgrounds, all colors, all ages. And that's kind of stayed where the CRPA was as laws developed. There's a law we'll talk about that actually started back in the 1930s to deprive people of their ability to carry their firearms while archery hunting. So the assault on the Second Amendment, I would say, actually started during the Great Depression here in California. But it's like, the old, I call it the frog in the kettle thing. They were small little things. And so, the frog swims around in the kettle like in the old class. I don't think they do it anymore, but they did it when I was in high school. And frog has no clue that the water's being turned up underneath it. And where the other
Right.
frog that's introduced to hot water immediately like walks on water and gets out of there. The one that's slowly been warmed up and it just keeps swimming until it's dead. And that is basically what happened. And California was probably the first place, really, as a state to start to go, we're not going to let a tragedy go to waste to push a bad ideology. And so when I first went up in the Capitol to start working on legislation, doing stuff, it was in the late 80s and into the 90s, working on staff and things. And every tragedy that would happen in California that had anything to do with firearms became an impetus to seize firearms, to run roughshod over the Second Amendment. And the problem was so many Californians at the time who were gun owners didn't fight back. They complained. Don't get me wrong, John. They complained. They threw money at it. And they said, well, this is just stupid. But they didn't fight back. And then by the 90s and 2000s, still wasn't fighting back, but name calling was perfectly acceptable just to say the left is stupid, this is stupid, that is stupid. But what they didn't realize that I started to pick up back then was I worked on educational bills at the time, and I realized if one side on an educational issue didn't come in, then staff and everybody else working it, that's all they knew. That became their lexicon of knowledge. And that is
Right.
one
So
of the
they're very
challenges.
internally focused.
Yeah, and that was one of the challenges that you and I were talking before the program. You have to realize members come and go. You and I shared several people we knew back in the day that were empowered. They're not empowered anymore. Some are not even here on the planet anymore. But staff, the people that work the building, people like you and I, we're still here. We're still in the game. And so it's why I always tell people staff comes and goes. I mean, members come and go, but staff is forever. And I think that's a real important part of this gun control is the staff and the members that are in there now, they're not new to this topic. And there are some strong nuances that is allowing for some really opportunistic change to come by. What it concerns me is the 2A community at large is fairly receptive when there's an emergency piece of legislation or emergency legal action to jump in when it's negative. But when it's positive, when it's something good, you're lucky if you get 10% of what jumps in on the negative side to support it. And that goes back to that thing that if you're a staffer and you're putting your neck out to do the right thing and you get this many people, but when you do the wrong thing, you get this many people. I mean, it's simple math.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess my question would be, we kind of worked out a topic agenda ahead of time, and we have kind of these two topics. One's kind of like, have we been doing fighting gun control, and then what's on the agenda for this session? But we can work it backwards, however you think that is the best way to acquaint our readers with the battle at hand.
Yeah. So I think the big battle that everybody remembers is 2016. You had Gavin Newsom as lieutenant governor wanting to run for governor. You had Kevin De Leon, who was in charge of the Senate and run for governor. And we ended up with a thing called Gunmageddon because someone got news. I never could figure out which one got word of the other one's plans. Kevin DeLeon had Gunmageddon where they took 6 bills, they got it amended, meaning took bills that had nothing to do with firearms, made them about firearms, and got them passed basically in 24 hours. At the same time, Gavin Newsom had Proposition 63, the Safety for All Act, which had Californians actually read what it said.
Of those titles, safety for all,
Yeah, would have realized
provided to you by your government.
yeah, would have realized it had nothing to do with safety. And that has led to some of the landmark cases, such as Duncan v. Bonta and Rhodey v. Bonta. The first one dealing with standard capacity magazines, the second one dealing with the ammunition purchasing scheme here in California. And so, when that got blew through, a couple of different things happened. One, organizations that are against the Second Amendment, Brady, Everytown, Giffords, except who are all out of state organizations, said California is now the test bed to come in and push our ideas because there's this wide open freeway. And so we went from having maybe a dozen bad bills a year to as much as 3 years ago, there were 100 bad bills in one session introduced. And
Oh,
what
jeez.
people didn't realize nationwide was, okay, so fine, flee California, but those bills are coming with you because a lot of those groups spent the money, spent the time, used money from USAID prior to Trump cutting it to pay for people to be in the Capitol wearing different T-shirts to say outlandish stories. One of the ones I'll never forget was we were talking about an AR-15 bill. This lady that came in with 80s hair just puffed out beyond belief told the story of how her ex had fired the firearm and the bullet had hit the end of her hair and had threw her back 35 feet in the wall and almost killed her. Okay, anybody knows anything about ballistics physics knows, yeah, impossible. That never happened.
The bullet could hit her body and it wouldn't go
Right.
back 35 feet, let alone her hair, in which it would just go right through it.
Right. But I watched every member of the dais clutch their pearls, get all emotional, you poor thing. And I'm like trying to use my 2 minutes to give a 30-second physics lesson. It was a lie, and then fight the bill. So it was very, very complex. The other part of it was other 2A groups had largely committed themselves to a policy of we don't fix bad legislation, we just stand and fight it by saying no. And I had a really great conversation that I will share. It was with Reggie Jones Sawyer, who used to be the head of public safety. And Reggie came out to a outdoor sporting caucus trap shoot. And after talking to the kids, he came up and he said, these youth are amazing, Rick. And I said, yes, they are, sir. And he's like, but they're telling me they can't go to college because of me. I said, well, partially because of you. I said, you led part of this, but yeah, I said, you passed a assembly bill called 2571, which stopped advertising to youth a couple years ago. And he said, well, what if I take money from this to help them out? You can't do that. Why? Because of a different bill you passed. And he literally, the man came up with 4 ideas, and I had to keep looking at him saying, and again, Assemblyman, you can't because of a law you passed. You can't because of a law you passed. And he was like,
Interesting.
I had no idea. And I said, well, we testified about this. And he said, you probably did. And this is sad. Now, we were able to beat 2571 in the court and reverse a lot of the damage had been done, but he also realized there was about 4 years of kids who had full ride scholarships. And what really hit him was he didn't realize that shooting sports is the one sport that if you're in a wheelchair, if you're, whether you're a paraplegic or, anything else, you're not on the bench. You can compete at Olympic level in it. And
Well, it's also another sport that economically, as long as someone can help you with a firearm,
uh
it's not like ice hockey where the parents have to be loaded
right.
to participate. This is it's like
Yeah. So he realized that, and he was very good to get me into some other offices where we could just have conversations and say, look, I know some of your constituents aren't big on this, but let's look at what this really is, what it really does. And those conversations are starting to breed it's not balanced by any stretch of the imagination, but we're going to have some conversations that didn't take place 5 years ago, 20 years ago. We were able to get a bill the first bill in a couple of decades to get through, which was Assembly Bill 548, that helped FFLs because we had this weird thing inside the code which said,
hold on a minute. I very few of our watchers are going to know what an FFL
yeah,
is.
federal firearms license dealer. And what was going on was the penal code written back in the 70s had said you have to have a steel door with certain features on it. But the fire code, which is updated almost annually, had said that door was illegal to have. So you go to open up a gun store, you're told by DOJ, get this door to match the penal code, but then the fire marshal wouldn't let you open because you had the wrong door. So then you change to the fire marshal's door. And then when DOJ came for your annual inspection, you could get up to a $5,000 fine. And this was causing problems. And then landlords would be like, we're not changing the door every, 6 months. So out, you're done, which kills your business. And so we were able to run a bill that said, no, you will go to the fire marshal as long as it has these safety issues. And we were able to resolve it. So now federal firearms license dealers, that's not something that is stopping them from doing business. It's now everybody's in agreement.
I mean, so I guess it's at one level, I can certainly understand the exasperation of some other groups that are like, hey, these people, they don't want to make any meaningful changes. And then your perspective is, hey, the reality is the Democrats control super majorities of this legislature. You can work with them. I mean, it's not like you, Rick Travis, are going to any Republicans and saying, vote for a bad bill
Right.
because I made it a little less bad. We're going to see if we can get a good bill.
Right.
And if we can, you should vote for it,
Right.
right? So
And so
I think that's a good
another
perspective.
example of that would be, back in the 1930s, Republican and Democrat came together. So both parties owned this. And it said, you know what? And this is what I call like a minority report bill. And if people aren't familiar, it's a movie that was made some time ago with Tom Cruise in it. And the whole premise behind the movie was a group of people would predict that somebody was going to do something wrong. And so they'd arrest them and try them before it actually happened. Some of our bills have been developed for decades over, John, something might bad happen. So we're just going to make a preemptive bill to stop it or find somebody. And so a great example of that
Right.
was somebody might take, and you got to think about it, in the 1930s, we're talking revolvers, and we didn't have a lot of snub nose. Most of them were like 4-6 inch barrels. We're going to take a revolver, shoot a deer, and then run an arrow through that hole to say they did archery. Okay, odds of that ever happening seem pretty far-fetched. But okay,
Yeah,
they
of
passed
course.
this bill, and then they say in the regulatory code for fish and game, do that across every species of animal you could hunt. And it stayed that way through the 40s, through the 50s, 60s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. And 2013, the person that was in my position before, Roy Griffith, and I started to go to the Game Commission, started to push back. And over a period of about 4 years, we were able to regain everything but deer because deer was in the Fish and Game Code. It wasn't a regulatory policy. We just had Assembly Bill 1912, which ends this, makes it so you can always carry it. And two of the Democratic members that were reviewing the bill literally said, and this shows you how things are changing, said, well, shouldn't this just be open carry when you're hunting? Why does it have to be with the CCW? Like, that just would make more sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm like, but that conversation, John, wouldn't have happened a decade ago. But it's
Mm.
now we've normalized that, hey, we can actually pull apart a bill, pull apart a problem, talk about it, discuss it. And part of that has been because CRPA makes an effort that twice a year we take up men and women. And when I say men and women, I'm talking from high school age all the way to much older than me and from all parts of the state. And they sit down in the offices and discuss personally how bad bills have impacted them and why some of the good bills being proposed would be helpful to them. And that has been, for the first time in over 50 years, the other voice that has been missing in the Capitol, the voice of the people who are
That's
being impacted.
that's great, Rick. So yeah, really good. So talk to us. It's 2026. The legislative session has been going on for a few months now. If I'm a gun rights advocate in California, I'm a hobbyist, I'm a gun shooter, or maybe I just studied the Revolutionary War and understand there's a reason why we have a Second Amendment. What are the things on the radar for this cycle, for this session?
Yeah, we have bills that we're opposing, and I'll mention a couple of them that are very interesting. One of them is Assembly Bill 2047 by Assemblymember Rebecca Bauer Cahan, and it's dealing with three-dimensional block technology, which is used in 3D printers. And the idea is, if you bought a 3D printer, it would not be capable of doing anything that would make a firearms part. The problem with that is the same definitions of firearms parts are the same definitions you would use for, say, medical technology, structural engineering, architectural engineering. So we've been able to put together a very broad coalition of people that you normally wouldn't find on a bill fighting this together because, number one, it's not going to stop a criminal from going to another state and buying it. Number two, anybody that knows about programming knows there's lots of ways to rewrite your machine. So this is just an ill thought out bill. It's not surprising. It comes from some of the groups outside of our state to try to influence bad legislation. We also have another bill that we don't care for, and it's from Assemblymember Berman, and it's a centralized list. And what this is, they've tried this before, but it's supposed to be a list of all the public institutions, such as you could have community colleges, you're talking state colleges, but community colleges, a lot of times you have high schoolers going there, and it would give them access to public firearms records, which could cause them to be able to be doxxed. There's not a whole lot of guardrails to protect people. So we're obviously opposing it. And then in the Senate, we have a bill that we're opposing, Senate Bill 948, and it's called Firearms Safety Certificate. Again, this is one of those cute things at the top. Why wouldn't you want people to be safe? But here's what it really is. It's anybody going in the future to get a firearms safety certificate has to take an 8-hour class, which means the class you normally take and the test you normally take at a federal firearms license dealer or a gun store, to put in lay terms, would no longer be able to be there. You would have to take a day off of work to go take an 8-hour class, and then a second day off of work to go do a live fire exercise. And this is where it gets interesting because let's just say you're going to do that. California is not like other states. In other states, you can buy firearms after you've tried them. California, you have to buy before you try, which means how do I take a test with a firearm that I can't buy till I've taken a test with a firearm? Like it's this weird
And that's
logic.
crazy.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, it's weird logic, and again, it's just one more impediment, one more way to make it harder and more expensive. Because of course, all of these things come with fees. So
right.
it's not only your time off of work; it's the fees that are involved.
Yeah.
Don't get me going. I
But
mean,
then we have some really
I
good
mean,
bills too that I want to put on to show some differences. We have Assembly Bill 1948, which is kind of a version of a bill last year, which was Assembly Bill 1092. They both deal with firearms concealed carrying licenses. That's your CCW. Currently in the state of California, you get it the first time for 2 years and you have to renew every 2 years. We've been pushing to extend that, and this bill will actually push that out to 3-year renewals. We're getting that.
as a CCW holder, I think that's a great
Yeah,
idea.
and we want to,
So,
if once we get this one through, then yes, we're going to continue to push to get that out to 4 or 5 and hopefully eventually 6-year renewals. The other one was last year we had a horrible bill, 1333 by Assemblyman Zabur, that removed basically castle doctrine, your right to defend yourself in your home and things like that. And
yeah, I read about that. That guy ended up beating a pretty hasty retreat
yeah,
from the reaction from people.
but we are fighting
Um,
against that again. by introducing a bill, and so that's one of the things too, we're countering with bills, and this bill is Assembly Bill 2584, and it is called the Preemptive Self-Defense Act of 2026. And it has made it out of
And
its
this
first.
would assert a positive right so
Yeah,
that it's not questionable?
and what it does is it makes it so that whatever professional background, training, fighting skills would no longer be taken into account when it came to reasonable defensive action. So no longer could somebody say, well, John, you took karate when you were 10.
Therefore, you had a secret weapon you could have used
Right.
instead of
No,
pulling out a gun.
yeah, none of that comes into it now. So if we can get this bill to the governor's desk and get him to sign it, that will be very, very positive. And then also we have another bill, which this is going to be one of those bills that people are going to say, you got to be kidding me. We don't do this. And no, we're one of the few states that don't. But that is, we have a bill that is called Senate Bill, 1021, and it's fishing and hunting youth programs. And what this is about is we have, unfortunately, a lot of children here in California that have life-threatening illnesses. And when you're fighting a life-threatening illness, there's often a very narrow window when the family can get away from all the tragedies that are going on in that fight and be able to go give that child their final wish, whatever that is. Many organizations have shied away from fishing and hunting and providing that wish because that window, it's hard to figure out how you're going to make it work, because sometimes when the window for the kid opens up, it's not the correct window for hunting or fishing, for that matter. This bill would allow the Game Commission and the nonprofits to provide that service to work together and come up with workarounds that would make it so those kids could go out in the wilderness, which is one of the best things when you're fighting a life threatening illness, for their families that opportunity. And that bill currently has 14 co sponsors, both in the Assembly and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, and it made it out on a unanimous vote out of its first committee. So there are good things happening along with the bad things, and it's a fairly balanced session right now.
That's great. Is there anything, maybe there doesn't need to be anything right now. One of the things that's always frustrated me as a CCW holder is this whole idea that I know that the Supreme Court had their infamous Bruin decision, and it changed things so that there were a lot more opportunities for a CCW holder to carry in California. And then the legislature turned right around and passed a whole new raft of sensitive places,
Right.
so that, like, now if I have a CCW and I'm going into a restaurant that happens to have a liquor license, I got to go put it in the car because they don't want me in a restaurant that happens to serve alcohol. By the way, the restaurant that this first happened in only serves drinks at nighttime,
Right.
but the bar's in there.
Well,
And
and
so
also create the problem that you would go to a shopping mall with your CCW, and because they happen to have a restaurant on the far corner of the parking lot, you technically couldn't park in the parking lot because that restaurant served alcohol.
right.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard it all. I guess this issue, I bring it up, but it's probably something that's going to be stuck resolving itself in the courts, because I don't know that this legislature is interested in. I mean, the reason they passed the new sensitive places is to push as hard as they can against the Supreme Court's decision, right?
Right. Well, and some of it is, I think a lot of people are starting to stand up and communicate. Like I said, we have many more people coming into the Capitol to talk about this from a different opinion that most of the staff has ever seen. We've worked very hard to get that staff out to see for themselves these things. And it's a slow process. I mean, we've had 40 years of not doing this. We've had about 3.5 of doing it. And just in that 3.5 years, I've seen an incredible amount of change in attitudes and at least acceptance to, like, yes, let's look at this. Let's see if we can find some middle ground. Now, sometimes that middle ground isn't everything everybody wants. I know everybody wants the magic bullet. Rick, come up with the bill that gives us everything. That's never going to happen. Nobody could get
Right.
that.
It's only going to happen if we can get 80 Chuck Michels in the legislature,
But like I've told
which isn't going
people,
to happen.
we lost these rights over a period of a half a century when you really look at it. We're not going to get it back in 2 years. This is going to be a fight to slowly get it back. And a lot of that fight takes education, it takes people learning. And, I have a friend in the Democratic Party who was not big on hunting, wasn't big on any of this stuff. And we were able to get that individual out to go on a duck hunt. And a friend of mine got that person out, completely changed them, and they had a different perspective. We also had a member of the Game
Just look,
Commission recently, in the last couple of years, who used to be anti-dogs, which are critical for hunting, and was believing a lot of things that were coming out of different groups like PETA. And we actually got that individual to go out and see for themselves how the dogs work in the field. And the very next Game Commission meeting, when the group started their regular commentary, he stood up and said, "Stop. quit lying. That's not what happens. And refused for the time that he was on it. And he was an appointee from Gavin Newsom and worked as an advisor to Gavin Newsom after that. So I look at
That's
people and
great.
say, if we can have conversations, educate people, treat them with respect, get them out and see this for themselves, we win far more than we lose that way.
All right. So, Rick, because as we get ready to tie this up, where do people who watch this that want to get involved, they want to get engaged? We talked about CRPA.org. Is there a sign up for legislative updates, or is there
Yes.
a legislative action center? If you were going to tell me, hey, John, you want to get involved, this is how you do it.
Yeah, there's two ways to do it. So the first way I would say is go to crpa.org, go to our chapter program, see if there's a local chapter in your area, because every chapter has a legislative team that I meet with once a month on a Zoom call, And then if you really want to get involved and go to Capitol Days and everything else, then you can join the Legislative Action Group by going to the legislative page and doing the same thing, just sign up and getting involved.
Great. So, Rick, I wish that we could go on at length, but one of the things that I have watched, having done a lot of these now, is we're right about the point where we start to lose folks if we go on for too long. And I want to make sure that they don't get intimidated by the length of the video. But hopefully, we can have you back maybe after the session is
I'd
over,
love to.
and you can let us know how things went. In the meantime, on behalf of all of us who believe in a strong Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms, thank you for what appears to be a very, very long dedicated commitment on your part to the CRPA. And again, I would just remind all of the people that are watching, CRPA is a great thing to join. I joined. You get an awesome magazine, which, by the way, this particular latest issue has an awful lot written by that guy. Rick's got a lot of stuff in there because they're talking about not only legislative issues, but he's talking about conservation issues. And we didn't talk about it today, but you wouldn't even believe what's going on Catalina Island. That's a whole other story, and the deer that are there. But if you join, it's great. It's awesome. I went and got myself a little cap. I should have worn it today. That would have impressed everybody. But Rick, thank you very much for your time, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you.